Good. Are we live?
It says live on YouTube.
Okay, thank you. And we can start recording now.
You want to record now?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, so I'll start recording now, and then we'll get going.
Okay, so I'm going to let everyone in and start in a minute. So hello and welcome to everyone. Some of you I see are back. They were part of our earlier webinars as well. So thank you for joining everyone and welcome to our speakers, Gisle, Magdalena, and Hannes. So today we are on our third in a series of 8 webinars, which are called Mindful Modernisms. Today's webinar is called The Liminal Sensual Magic of Built Space, featuring Hannes, Gisle, and Magdalena in conversation. So this webinar is actually part of an 8 webinar series, which brings in cross-cultural and interdisciplinary discussions. It is organized by the academic initiatives of the Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats, in collaboration with the Department of Interior Design at the University of Manitoba and the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College. It is a series for the promotion of critical, mindful, and contemplative approaches in design thinking, education, and practice. What we do is we put in 2 distinguished speakers, today 3, in dialogue around modern and mindful themes. The speakers who come to our sessions, they are from different backgrounds and not necessarily design backgrounds, but other backgrounds like art and design, history, graphic design, representation, gender studies, psychology, and sociology, but also interior design, architecture, and other design disciplines. The series is supported, the series is supported by the Royal Architectural Institute of Canada and Interior Designers of Canada. It is partially funded by the Ontario Association of Architects and a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We also want to thank at this stage each of our presenters for their generous time and effort in making these series happen, as well as our students, in particular, Megan Fannenauer, Cameron Collins, and Ali Zamani, who have helped us in various capacities for the promotion and for bringing this series to fruition. The series is curated by Kurt Esperance-Peters, Roger Connor, and myself. Mindful Modernism is part of a larger scheme of things, an ongoing series of webinars, publications, studios, and seminar courses, and exhibitions as well, organized by the academic initiatives, Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats, University of Manitoba's School Department of Interior Design, and the Bachelor of Interior Design program at Algonquin College. Kurt, who is the co-curator, is here with me. Brief introduction to Kurt's background. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Interior Design of the Faculty of Architecture in University of Manitoba, and the co-director for the academic initiatives at Canadian Centre for Mindful Habitats. His research examines critical design theory and pedagogy, focusing on the relationship between the built environment and human thinking and experience. He's deeply fascinated by the Victorian polymath John Ruskin, and we would want to hear more about that in later sessions at some point. But I will now hand it over to Kurt, who will be moderating the session.
Thank you, Pallavi, for the introduction. And thank you to our presenters, and thanks to everybody in attendance today. I would like to introduce our presenters and then talk a little bit about what the session is about, and then we will begin the presentations. Each of our presenters will be doing about a 20-minute presentation on the liminal in relationship to their thinking and their practice. And then also afterwards, we will have a discussion that will bring together their thinking on this topic, and then also developing larger ideas in relationship to the built environment. So it's my pleasure to introduce Magdalena Haggard and Gisle Loken. From their architectural practice, 70 Degrees North Architecture in Tromsø, Northern Norway, Magdalena and Gisle have developed experimental and critical approaches to architecture and planning in an Arctic context, but also concerning general perspectives on consumption of natural landscapes and resources, urban development and modernity in the light of severe global changes. The work combines various transdisciplinary methods inspired by anthropology, philosophy, architecture, and artistic approaches, and is based on a comprehensive ecophilosophy understood as social ecology, mental ecology, and environmental ecology. The approach encompasses issues of complexity, multiplicity, vulnerability, contingency, and indeterminacy, where investigations and proposals are centered on notions of openness and planning for an unknown future. Their work is constantly evolving and is tested, developed, and processed through commissions, competitions, teaching, academic work, and publications. Our next presenter is Hannes Stifel. Hannes is an architect based in Vienna, Austria. Stifel and Company architects conceive, design, and realize buildings, terrains, structures, and processes that reflect, convert, and mediate the dynamic interplay of those natural and human forces that shape the constructions of the crust of the earth. Since 2013, Hannes is a professor of architecture at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, where he directs the platform Ecology, Sustainability, and Cultural Heritage at the Institute for Art and Architecture. So please join us in welcoming our three guest speakers for today. As an introduction to today's session, what we're doing is we're examining mindful modern alternatives. We began with the position that if we believe it is relevant to contest modernism today as a design methodology, ideology, and belief system, can we afford not to be modern? Can mindfulness as a notion, concept, and contemporary jargon resensitize the lost or unfinished soul of a modernist project in the widest sense of the word? What mindful modern alternatives are available to form a potential future by expanding our sensitivity and diversity? And how can we develop a practice to think both individually and collectively in a mindful manner? So in our pursuit of mindful approaches to the built environment, we are suggesting an opening up of architecture to a new vocabulary. In today's session, we examine operative words such as silence, darkness, unformed, unending, magic, and myth, which were seemingly left out of the original modernist design repertoire and vocabulary. And we ask, how does this link with the multidisciplinary investigations derived from areas such as neuroscience, social psychology, and theological contemplative studies that can and that should affect architectural thought and practice? Putting mindful modern architects together like Magdalena and Gisle and Hannes in conversation will open up the contemplation of built space today, investigating the magical and mysterious space that architecture can still achieve. So with that being said, I would like to invite Hannes to begin today's presentation with his take on the liminal space. So Hannes, I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you very much, Pallavi and Kurt, for this introduction. Thank you for the invitation. Also, thanks to Roger Connor, who I know since I have also taught once in Ottawa for a semester. Very good rememberings to that. And I'm very happy to have had the chance to think about these terms you have offered for this session, since these are not words which are used that often in our vocabulary. Maybe I should start to share the screen. Okay, do you see it full screen? Is that okay?
We don't see it full screen yet.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what I called this short statement or talk mindful environment, since I think the mindfulness in our fields of designing, making architecture cannot be detached from the ecological. And in my opinion, I'm very close with the ideas of J.J. Gibson, who replaced the term space with the term environment, since everything, all our environments, all beings in our environments are connected with each other and in interchange with each other. And the other kind of topic I would like to look at today is the endlessly liminal. I think particularly in our profession as designers or creators of space and builders, we are always in a liminal space. I understand the liminal as something, as a transitional zone, and we are always working on something coming from one medium or from one status into another. And while we are working on our projects, we are always in this space in between. And I think this is a very interesting moment which let us really think a lot what is before and what is after. So it is a very temporal work we are doing, and we have always to look back at the one and to look forward to what will become. And this liminal space, I understand in this way as a very transitional one. And you know, when some of the words which Kurt was introducing, this magic or this kind of, yeah, let's keep with the magic. It's interesting that I found this in the build work most of the time in modern architecture. I mean, whether if it was in La Tourette from Corbusier, or here in Frederick Keisler's Book of the Shine of the Book in Jerusalem, these are moments which one has really to experience and one has to be there. And yet it is not always only the built realm which can create that, but in the imagination it's often also already perceptible when one is working on a scheme which is not yet realized. And I particularly would like to look today also, I was not thinking about modernism for quite a while so much, but to look in a mindful way at the work which was done in modern architecture, or maybe better say, to I suggest a close reading of projects which were done in that time, but with regard to the mindful aspects which are absolutely inherent in this work. And I think thus also respect the architectural legacy of our recent past. And this past is defined by a series of modernisms. And sorry, I did not put it in brackets because for me it's so clear that there is not one modernism, but there are many modernisms. And at the moment, there is a lot of rejection of ideas which were built then. And I think it's worth to look at it closer, or also to work with this legacy in a way to find out what we can learn from that in order to go into a future which is defined by very needs of really change our whole way of living, our way of working, and which is probably the most challenging and question we face these days, and also probably a very liminal space, our time per se. And when you look at the Honor Freedom, the superstructures, megastructures of the 60s and 70s, which proved to be, when they were built in these very few cases, not successful on some levels. I think it's interesting to look closer and think always about what was behind that. And when we look at the metabolists in Japan, this was maybe a position in history in Japan like we face it now. It was after the war, and they had to deal with a lot of housing issues which were like incredibly and almost not to be solved from one generation. So this was a reaction on needs on a certain time. And what is interesting when one looks at these projects, that they are, we know most of the time the drawings or the models of those projects. But when we think about Jonas Friedman, for example, he was really looking for a different way of living, for a new lifestyle, for new communities, for people who live differently together. And it was not that only what was drawn, which was the idea behind, but really the search for a different society. And when, you know, this is probably very familiar, much more familiar to many listeners today probably than to me, but when I was there, this was such a place where I felt really like touched and in a magic way. And yet, if there are a lot of problems, and if it's not that successful in many ways, I think it was an idea to get beyond the problems of a certain time. And I think this is a very, it's always the kind of the most important issue for designers at any time, I think. And I go now to a project from Alfred Huth and Günter Domenik here in Austria, where they kind of try to go on with these ideas. So these like projects which I'm showing here from the 60s and 70s, from the classical modernism in architecture, were translated in other countries, in other projects, in other times. And Alfred Huth and Günter Domenik started to think already back in the time, like Kurokawa, in metabalistic ways, and biology became an issue, and the kind of the whole metabolism of plants or beings was tried to translate into living units or into habitats. And I think This brings me now to Frederick Keisler. And Frederick Keisler, here we see him at work in his endless house, and the endlessness is also such a topic. The endlessness, which is always, let's say, the cycles within ecology, is an endless process. And Frederick Keisler was his whole life working on the idea of endless houses, endless theaters, like what we see here, or then also the universal theater, which was a translation of that. And the endlessness is not only the endlessness of form, but also the endlessness in terms of a ecological thinking. And maybe I come to the term to the idea of ecological thinking. And I just have to find. We did a project in the university with students, which was called Rethinking Keisler. And now I do not have my paper here, I'm sorry for that. Sorry for the, okay, Rethinking Keisler. And I would like to quote Frederick Keisler in a text from 1960, where he was talking about the Coriolism of nature and the Coriolism of the plastic arts. We are making the catastrophic error of basing our wisdom on a past, its facts, questionable indeed, while in truth the present is a marriage of the nuclei of the bearers of the past and the standards of the future, simply because no future can evolve that has not its real roots in the values of the past, no matter how far past. We work with myths of facts instead of with facts of a myth. Events and memory of events are continually transformed by the present to procreate the future. This is the Coriolism of nature, and it is a pluralistic genesis. And it is not a monotheistic configuration, but a unity of a constantly changing diversity. And I think this is and quote end, and I think this is a real ecological approach. And then he says in the text on the Coriolism of the plastic arts, before this was the Coriolism of nature, now about the plastic arts, which is including architecture. I quote, "The traditional art object, be it painting, a sculpture, a piece of architecture, can no longer be seen as an isolated unit, but must be considered within the context of changes in time and space, moving physically and percepted visually in all directions of environment, be it man-built or part of nature. Thus, we are stimulated constantly by split seconds, physically or emotionally, with a world already existent or in the making. Object and environment remain constantly one in unison with past and future. Consequently, the environment becomes equally as important as the object, if not more so, because the object breathes with the surroundings, as we do. No object of nature or of art can ever exist or has ever existed without environment. As a matter of fact, the object itself can expand to a degree where it becomes its own environment." Quote end. So rethinking Gisle is an ambitious endeavor. It is, and it's complex alone in consideration of the vast range of his work in various fields: architecture, industrial design, visual and performing arts, exhibition design, teaching, theoretical writing, and literary reflection. The latter at times affected disciplines of natural sciences as well as metaphysical realms. The studio we were doing with students investigated all of Frederick Keisler's documented projects in order to get an idea of a design culture that arose in interaction with his Coriolism theories. Decisive for these theories are the interactions between the so-called human, the natural, and the technological environments. as well as their understanding of reality and of the forms in which reality visually presents itself, as the result of a constant battle for predominance between integrating and disintegrating forces. A contemporary reading of these writings enables us to recognize Keisler as a convinced practitioner and missionary of ecological thinking, and ecological thinking by design. The first rediscovery of Keisler's work through architects was a rediscovery via space. The second one shall be one via environment. It is surprising that environmentalist, in quotation mark, Keisler, has chosen clearly defined boundaries for most of his ecological case studies. With his design proposals, he works, generally speaking, in quite small scales, and his architectural models were presented in a way that would, through a first reading, almost unavoidably position them in the world of objects. And yet, it is one of the recognitions of the studio that we did, that it is not implicitly about the object, but rather about its impact on and reciprocity with its environments. And thus, to put it differently, it is about the object and the form in which it presents itself, since it sets the orientation of the mentioned impacts and reciprocities. So his quote end, sorry. So his Corellis manifest was accompanying him through his life as much as his studies on the endlessness of the endless house and the endless theater. And I just would like to quote shortly Sanford Quinto, what he said about this endlessness. He said, I quote, Keisler's concept of endlessness was in essence an expression of the continuity of every point and object in the world with what operates Corellism, with what operates beyond it, in fields both proximate and remote. The doctrine of Corellism projects a seamless ecological vortex that permits no essential division between worldly objects, their structural deployments, or the motives, habits, and desires that brought them to be. Quote end. I just switched through a few of the pictures of Keisler's endless house, which included then really a connection to the environment, for example, through this clock, color clock, which shows the time of the day via colors in the building, and then the galaxies, where he made constructions that brought sometimes things together which did not belong to each other. And it reminds me always on Eisenstein's contrast montage concept, where he says when you arrange or bring together things which are not belonging to each other in a particular specific way, it explodes to a new entity. And these galaxies Keisler did then also spatially. And now I would like to make a change. I just wanted to introduce that there was this ecological thinking and thus also a mindful thinking back in the 30s, 40s with Frederick Keisler. And I would like to go a little bit more back where I first was thinking really about modernism and with the black paintings of Francisco Goya, which might be, or in my understanding or understanding of others, could be seen as a precursor of modernism. And his black paintings show also that he was a very mindful observer of his time and of at the court in Madrid at his time. And that he was addressing social issues independent of what kind of punishment he would face. He was then also brought to Inquisition with that. And I think I was always touched with that. And when I did my diploma in my architectural studies, I just tried to translate these observations into a built scheme. And this was then a building where the architect or the inhabitant who inhabited this spatial Goya paintings was only interested to observe visitors in order to find out how the view of visitors on these translations of Goya translate or change his own idea and his own image of Goya's paintings. So again, this interaction between observer and the observed. It was also, I was also working at that time with the ideas of the modern physics that the phenomena is already translated or changed by its observation, which is for sure not so easily to translate in another scale, in our architectural scale. But I think a thesis does not have to be always true or in order to have an impact. And this building then, I was 2 weeks after my diploma, which this was a drawing of it, I had to hand in, because I was invited, a project for the Kunsthaus Graz. And we just translated this idea of Goya into a contemporary exhibition building, where you see this kind of conus, and this conus was pointing to the Stadt, to the Schlossberg in Graz, in the south of Austria. And we declared this Schlossberg and the environment of the Kunsthaus also as part of the space program of the Kunsthaus, so that there was not a distinction anymore of the world outside and inside of the building. And at the same time, it was always the idea to finish a very icon of modernism in architecture, which is the Church of Firminy by Le Corbusier. And here I want to say this liminal or this transitional phase where we as architects are always in, was standing there for quite a while. For 50 years, you saw only this ruin which you see on the right hand, and the building was only finished about 10 years ago. And I was about, I don't know, 5 times there, and that was a magic place, just to imagine what kind of space this would have created if it would have been built. And this introduction of one scheme, like the one which came out of one project into another site, into another project, was the first time in this Kunsthaus Graz project. But then I was confronted with that idea much more with that building in Innsbruck, a competition where the idea was that one brings a panorama building, or the painting of a panorama building. One builds a new building for that. The painting shows the fight of Napoleon's troops against the freedom fighters of Tyrol, and it should be exhibited new at the site where the battle, which is represented in the painting, really took place, which you can see a side plan on the bottom. And this brought us to this idea of, or this concept of faux terrain, the faux terrain, which is mediating between the two-dimensional reality of the canvas with the three-dimensional reality of the observer platform. And this terrain in between, which was a gradient, it is not so well visible here, a gradient from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions is called faux terrain. And here you see the site in our time and the painting on the bottom. And I do not want to explain the projects totally, but I would like to talk a little bit about the ideas of that. And maybe I just go through the images while I'm reading. The term of faux terrain originally described the 3-dimensional artificial landscape designed to mask the transition between the viewing space of the spectator and the representational space of 360 panoramas built in the late 18th and 19th century. Ultimately, false terrains can describe any artificial construct, but it is perhaps better to say that they obliterate the hierarchy between the real and the virtual in favor of a system of exchange between multiplicity of possible realities. Accordingly, we propose the notion of faux terrain both as an approach to design and as a description of a possible role for the architectural object. This approach embraces, or rather than denies, the inherent distance between architect and between building and public, as precisely the territory of productive interpretation. Like the faute terrain, the building becomes a mediating body, a material thing, foreign in some way to both designer and public, artist and spectator, that both links and separates them. Here, we refer to Jacques Rancière's notion of the emancipated spectator as one who dismisses the opposition between looking and acting and understands that the distribution of the visible itself is part of the configuration of domination and subtraction. It starts when we realize that looking is also an act that confirms or modifies that distribution, and that interpreting the world is already a means of transforming it. As a method of design, the faute terrain indicates the willful insertion of mediating structure between designer and the reality that he or she observes. In this sense, the concept of faute terrain produces a kind of double bind inscribed by the distance between its two terms. It asks the designer to both examine very closely that which exists in the form of an existing terrain, while simultaneously using these observations to produce a novel construct, a false site, non-site, or virtual terrain that can both mediate and be reinserted into the real. To the extent that the imagination implied in the false is reinserted into the concreteness of the terrain, any essential difference between these two realms is destabilized. This approach allows designers to imagine radical new possibilities for architecture through an intense observation of the world as it is, while acknowledging its fundamental contingency as its greatest opportunity. And this idea of a faute terrain, of this like false ground, we also try to, or we realized in the project for the Landhausplatz in Innsbruck, where it was a very difficult thing to negotiate the space or the kind of the perception of these two major built structures on the site. One is in the background, you see a building, the governmental building from the time of the Nazi regime, and in front you see a monument that more or less mirrors the porticos of the building, but it should communicate the opposite. This is a freedom memorial given by the occupation power of France in order to commemorate the resistance. And what we introduced is this terrain, which is only one material, a concrete material, concrete that has different textures in order to kind of set up a new approach towards this really weird monument and establish a new communication. And what is interesting is also what happened on a social basis, that the kids, the youngsters immediately appropriated the square, while the older people were calling it a lunarscape. Then the older people started to say, hey, but before it was our square. And we had then to establish a community group where we were part of in order to negotiate between the generations. At the moment, it is a hotspot in the city whenever the sun comes out. And also this monument got a total different meaning. And then I just conclude, I show just a few pictures. When the question of the urgency of ecological thinking became more aware also for the clients, we got very much into this, into the designing of public spaces. We proposed a spatial garden in the height of the buildings, 27-meter high, accessible, in order to cool down the micro-mesoclimate at Schwedenplatz in the center of Vienna, at one of the most visited places in the city of Vienna. And this is a project in Innsbruck from last year, where we introduced also, we try to find out how we really can establish architecture as cooling devices on a larger scale. And we lifted up the garden of a square into the height and it was also accessible. And it is always the dialogue between the future we are building for and the, as you see here with these monuments, with the past on which is represented through other elements on the side. And then for sure this upper layer should also be accessible, not only a climatic, but also a social, climatic device, but also a social place. And then, and I come immediately to an end, what we are doing now is we, particularly with in the platform Ecology, Sustainability, Cultural Heritage at the Academy of Fine Arts, we try to think about these megastructures anew, the megastructures of the 70s I have talked about at the beginning, to find out what they could, how they could help us today in order to deal with the new climatic regime, to use a term of Bruno Latour. Since also we will have a lot of migration, climate migration, and the next million in Vienna of inhabitants, it will soon be here. So we need to expand the city, but in order not to expand it out into the countryside, we try to establish gigantic climatic apparatus as city developments or city expansions on top of the city. And even if it looks like at the moment as kind of an idea of a Bandstadt, a band city of maybe of modernism, the idea is just to learn from that. And all, since we are in a liminal space, all what we try to do is to find out what we can learn from this time, from this legacy, and how we can translate it into a desirable future. And it is interesting that the students which worked the first semester on the project, more or less or mainly decided to think about the communities which could be established in there, not about the forms, not about the shapes, not about numbers or calculable matter, but really about how they want to live. And that's where we go from, and we hope we can translate that into a real scheme, which is then calculated to find out what this apparatus could change for the climate in the city of Vienna, always based on an observation and a negotiation and a dialogue with the people in the city and all these environments which are around us and we are part of. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hannes. Wonderful presentation. I would like to hand this over now to Magdalena and Gisle for their presentation. Would you like to start?
Yes, thank you very much. So first, we want to express our gratitude for this invitation to make a critical reflection about modernist thinking in architecture and society, and the possibility of discussing new alternatives, concepts and new language for architecture, which might be better suited to meet the severe social and environmental challenges of our time. Challenges which to a large extent can be traced back to the origin of modernity and its instrumental and utilitarian thinking and a mechanical view on nature. So no wonder many of us have an ambiguous view on modernism, since modernism on the one hand represents enlightenment, social reformation, democracy, scientific revolution, and cognitive emancipation. But on the other hand, modernism has allowed urbanization and industrialization, causing extreme pollution and destruction of nature beyond what is possible to recover. And likewise, modernism has unfolded well in a liberalist economic system, letting market forces to define anything as a commodity, exploiting nature and societies to the benefit of the few extremely powerful and wealthy. So not least for architects, modernism has brought endless new possibilities of constructing buildings seemingly beyond the laws of nature, but with the risk of further alienating ourselves from the ecosystems which we inevitably are a part of. So what we are talking about is therefore not to abolish the insight and knowledge gained through modernism, but to extract a higher degree of awareness for the interconnected ecology of humanity and nature. Or what Bruno Latour asked for as a change from matters of facts to matters of concern. So these are issues we work on in our practice. By nature never finished processes, but something we need to uncover and define in every project as a continuous process of learning. However, first we will use this opportunity to briefly introduce you to the practice of our office and the landscapes where our practice unfolds. So we are a small office of 6 architects located in the city of Tromsø at the latitude of 70 degrees north. So in the most northern part of the Norwegian mainland. Our practice comprises planning, education and academic work, and of course architectural production as public buildings and housing projects in urban environments, and also small buildings and installations in the landscape. Several of our projects include landscape investigations, studying the human relations to and dependency of and impact on landscapes and ecologies. These matters have become more exigent in our practice since global warming, pollution and overexploitation of natural resources increasingly are causing severe and permanent environmental changes in the format of energy production, like hydropower and windmills, roads, high voltage lines, industrial fisheries and fishing farming, and not least contested mining projects, all deteriorating the natural ecological balance of human and non-humans in the northern landscapes, also often with severe impact on indigenous landscapes and cultures. The fact that planners, architects and landscape architects are in the front line of these changes signifies a great concern for the complex ecologies we are inevitably part of, as clearly stated by Gregory Bateson. And therefore we need to develop less instrumental processes of what we already know and more operational and adequate tools for analyzing and understanding the landscape of what we maybe don't know. To get hold of the complex knowledge from the landscape, it will require an unbiased and genuine interest for real life, and a view on the landscape described by Dorian Massin as an unrestrained deviation of both time and space, literally giving space for a multiplicity of trajectories. So for the rest of this introduction to the conversation, we will try to exemplify an open landscape approach by examples from the master studio at the Bergen Architects School we conducted in 2017. The studio was based on a clear idea about the use of transversal knowledge, including anthropology, philosophy, sociology, politics, and geography, as a comprehensive foundation for architecture and landscape architecture. So the work from the studio is further edited into a book in collaboration with Acta Publishers in Barcelona. So most of the illustrations we will show now are from the book with the same title as the studio, which was Layered Landscapes Lofoten, Understanding of Complexity, Otherness and Change. The territory for the investigation is the islands of Lofoten in northern Norway, which is a distinct nature formation, which today is under severe pressure from strong regional and global changing forces. The Lofoten is the history of extremes, extreme nature, extreme weather conditions, extreme natural resources, and extreme survival. The islands of Lofoten float in a timeless mythical narration of battling between man and nature, rooted back to the time shortly after the last ice age, approximately 13,000 years ago. And it continues as an important trading area for dried fish throughout the Viking ages and until modern times. The fact that Lofoten has hosted the world's most precious fisheries of codfish for centuries and still does is the same areas where the seabed is assumed to hide a prosperous amount of oil and gas, and now in addition experiences a significant influx of tourists, signifies a latent and unbridgeable conflict that can change the landscape permanently. The people in Lofoten have always
Det här är den jag har på min dator. Bara fortsätt.
Okay. The people in
Sorry,
Lofoten
may I just interject? Your slides are not moving forward. Are you, or maybe you're still intending to be on this slide?
No.
Which do you see?
Sorry.
We still see the first one.
Oh,
You should have told us a little bit before.
okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. We have moved.
Yeah, but I will. I'll try again.
Okay.
Ska jag gå och hämta min?
Sorry.
No problem.
Yes.
This is a problem with technology. It has its benefits, but also it has its drawbacks, right?
I'm sorry, but we didn't know. We saw it changing here.
I will do it again.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you see?
Yeah, we can see it on your desktop.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
And does it change now?
Now it changes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now it's working.
But we'll just briefly go through it. This is from
Okay.
our practice, showing just some examples. And this refers to in spreading out in the landscape, the understanding of connection between human activities and landscape activities. And this is introducing the book that we are talking about. It's a complex layered landscapes of Lofoten, understanding of complexity, otherness, and change, which was this studio in Bergen at Bergen Architect School. And this is referring to the myth of Lofoten. Lofoten is a very distinct landscape formation. It's literally a collection of islands pointing out in the North Sea, and which has been extremely important for fisheries in 10,000 years. And it's there's connected a lot of myth and imaginations about the quite harsh weather conditions and extreme nature surrounding these islands. And it still is a very important location for fisheries. So I think we try to continue. Yeah. The people in Lofoten has always lived by the landscape and its renewable resources. However, external pressure from global economies and climate changes, and equally structural changes in the fisheries. Structural changes in the fisheries are not threatening to deprive local communities for their resources. And more than ever, this development demands awareness and knowledge to build resilience, to maintain flexibility for changes. But at the same time, to be in control of how the changes impact the complex interplay between landscapes and societies. So the Master Studio in Lofoten aimed mainly to create an open testing ground for the students to experiment with progressive mapping. So mapping can be understood as it can be used as a strong political tool, which can either restrict or liberate. It is therefore crucial to be conscious about the intentions behind mapping and also by which methods we are working. So according to Deleuze and Guattari, we should make maps that are experimental to be able to find the hidden and unexpected. This means that the mapping should be complex and artistic. To liberate new knowledge and creativity, mapping in its meaning clearly distinguishes from tracing, which is always reproduce already alleged knowledge. When mapping is kept complex, open and experimental, and follows the lines and trajectories revealed in the mapping process, new maps and knowledge will appear and new territories will uncover. So the studio work was developed during 5 months under the concept of complexity, imbrication, vulnerability, fieldwork, flexibility, and reorientation. And we will briefly go through some of these concepts and how it was treated by the students.
So the first concept of mapping and investigation is complexity, which signifies an open search for knowledge and experimentation on the unexpected and unknown. It opens for infinite connections and juxtapositions of what is past and what is to become, what is part and what is whole, regardless of limitations in time and space, revealing endless possibilities and new beginnings. In this open interactional space, there are, according to Dream Massey, always connections yet to be made, juxtapositions yet to flower into interaction. When entering the process of research and planning, the students inevitably became a part of the process, and the assignment called for the students to confront their personal background with the sometimes unexpected connection with Lofoten. The second concept for mapping is called imbrication, which juxtaposes a multiplicity of layers and concepts that are constituting society. The concept of imbrication means literally overlapping of different materials, overlaying structures or knowledge. The concept is useful in understanding of complex layering and connectivity with a broad social science and philosophical approach. The work of mapping of pelagic and coastal seabirds in Lofoten is such an example on how we, when digging deep and investigating thoroughly, always will really reveal new and important knowledge for our work. The vulnerability of the birds is obvious, but still their territories are commonly neglected when communities need to expand along a narrow shoreline. And it becomes a contested territory between nature and demands from modern society. Hence, an isolated tidal zone or a small littoral area is easily sacrificed for the notion of progress. And on the other hand, the bird's map of the territory is complex and consists of networks of nesting and breeding areas, different fields for feeding, depending on season and tidal conditions, protection from bad weather and heavy winds from varying directions, and from people and predators. The obliteration of even small parts cuts off the migration routes and patterns that the birds are operating along, and in total, this puts at risk the entire species of birds. The third concept, vulnerability, is obvious but still overseen in planning. Mapping of vulnerability means to gain a genuine understanding of a wide range of aspects of a context, as hypermapping of the supernormal. A survey giving flexible and evolving strategies for survival. Reading, mapping, and understanding the layers of vulnerability has the potential of making changes, because knowledge calls for awareness about the consequences of human activity, where planning must be precautionary and attentive to even the smallest elements of tacit knowledge that may have the power to change the plan. The fourth assignment is fieldwork, essential for any architectural process. It takes place as an encounter with the landscape and can be understood as a form of reality check, a means of adjusting one's thinking and practice to the exterior world. Our fieldwork opens for possible experimental investigation of landscapes, practices, and events that we previously have approached from a distance. As a creative practice and mode of representation, but also as embodied engagement and inquiry and as analytical trope. It is a confrontation of conceptions we have formed, but opens also for a more comprehensive experimentation in the landscape as a critical creative approach. In Lofoten, the nature-society connectivity is historically very obvious and close, but it is still in modern times a dependency that does not distinguish clearly what is nature and what is culture. The fifth concept of flexibility challenges the students to map the interwoven ecology of nature and society in Lofoten. The earthly conditions for life are in continuous change, and even the most conceivable harmonious and balanced systems and structures undergo a constant inner and outer battle and fight for survival. The most specialized species and societies are often the most vulnerable for external influence and environmental changes. And in times of what Gregor Bateson calls unpredictable change, the ability to adaptation and flexibility is crucial. This counts for ecosystems in nature, cities, or societies like in Lofoten, where places and communities regularly have been displaced in history because they did not have the ability or flexibility to adapt and develop. Finally, the students were to make use of the learnings from the whole semester, and the last assignment was labeled reorientation. As a new start or an opportunity to make things differently, or make more valid proposals based on new and deeper knowledge, or because new situations or changes require other solutions. It is also a moment of consolidation and recognition that everything is in continuous transition to something else. The moment of presence is so ephemeral and volatile that in reality, planning always deals with temporality, transformation, and continuation, more than conclusion and culmination. This means that everything we do are fragments in time and space with limited durability. What we try to achieve in our practice and with the students is always to develop new means to investigate and handle severe and unforeseen changes, not only by studying the immediate context of the project, but with an open mind, try to understand the different contexts and context of the context where the process unfolds. The speed of change and the fact that some changes in the landscape have reached beyond the point of no return requires a deep concern for the transforming forces and for developing appropriate tools to understand and work with these complex matters. We hope that this short introduction has shown that this work can never be concluded, but always considering space and time as interwoven dimensions and processes, ongoing, incomplete, and inconsistent throughout history. The approach goes beyond any notions about modernism, invoking a different kind of information that is not predetermined or instrumental, implying that the landscape itself holds the most vital and existential information for planning. Information about resilience and vulnerability that also can form new points of departure necessary for architecture and planning in a new paradigm of global environmental crisis. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Magdalena and Gisle. So this will conclude each presenter's presentations. And what I'd like to do is just bring all of the presenters together. And I just want to start with a series of questions to kind of get the discussion rolling. one of the things that we wanted to do in these sessions and these discussions was to bring people outside of their comfort zones, and each of you kind of know your topic area very well. So what I'd like to do is open up by just kind of destabilizing each person, and ask Hannes if you could maybe talk in terms of mindfulness, modernism, and the liminal about what you saw in Magdalena and Gisle's work, and then I'll reverse the question and have them ask you. So maybe just to kind of get the ball rolling, we've been talking about mindfulness and modernism and the liminal, and you were exploring that in your own work. But then how did you see this being manifested in the work of Magdalena and Gisle? Hannes, would you like to start?
Thank you, and thank you, Gisle and Magdalena, for your presentation. I think what is quite precise and beautiful is the way how with your work, through your work, and with your students and yourself, look at things that are there, and how you kind of as I understood it, in many ways a very descriptive approach in order to try to find out how the established ecosystems are working, and very aware of not only what the general changes in our time are doing to the ecosystems, but also what you as transformers, I would say, we are transformers, would do. And I think this statement that it should be not predetermined or not be, let's say, dominated, came very clear out also through the visuals and the material you have presented. And I think this is more or less a precondition today. I mean, as architects, we know that everything we do as architects, when we start to go beyond paper or the computer, is kind of violent, because we always interfere within many ecosystems, a variety of ecosystems, and very, very forcefully. And I think it came clearly out in your presentation that we have to be much more aware what exists, and that we are kind of visitors, and also this idea of that everything is in flux, or everything is like not forever, and that we are only kind of passing. What is this? Is a word, passing by us, or like that came clearly out. And thank you for that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Hannes. And I'll turn this over to Magdalena and Gisle. What, in terms of mindfulness, modernisms, or the liminal, did you see in Hannes's work?
Yeah, first I want to thank you. It was very beautiful and interesting, kind of drawn into your presentation. It was a gift. Thank you.
I think it's a good start. First, as Magdalena says, it was really beautiful. And I think this beauty is quite essential also, that we shouldn't forget that, not trying to define what beauty is, but still you get this sense of something beautiful that is essential. And I think that for the moment of course we get inspired by others, and for the moment I think for a long time we have been quite inspired by Gregory Bateson, and he talks about the artistic element, and he sort of sees the artistic element as a continuation of the natural beauty in a way. So he, as I understand, and he sets he relies quite a lot on the artist. He is sort of more or less a calling for the artist to sort of continue or be a part of the solving of the crisis then. So I think there's is also something that struck me with your presentation, that this is really important, that we keep up this notion of the importance of the artistic dimension in the work of an architect, and not being totally instrumental. But yeah, because that is also a tendency in our times that things becomes more and more mechanical in a way, and that maybe it's the sort of a vulgarization of the best part of a modernism also, that we are sort of, we don't need the artistic approach of the architect anymore, sort of. But I think you showed very well in all the projects that that's exactly what we need. So I'm not sure if it's a direct answer on your question, but I think that's a quite important aspect of it. So, and it was really beautiful. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. And I would agree. I think, you know, like the approaches, you know, that we're looking at here to, you know, engagement in the environment with architecture, you know, or anything that, you know, has to do, you know, with a built intervention. I think, you know, Hannes, you talking about this idea of this sort of, you know, violent interventions, you know, the sense that, you know, the building that kind of, you know, disrupts, you know, an existing landscape or, you know, ecosystem that is there, that, you know, can be approached from a variety of different ways. It could be, you know, using a very blunt force to create something, or something that could be very sort of sensitively, you know, intervene. It brings up a discussion that, you know, when we talk about, you know, approaches in mindful thinking applied to design and things like that, about really kind of understanding one person's, you know, situation and then also context. So the next question, you know, that might raise a little bit of debate on here, where do you kind of see the situation of architecture intervention sort of into the built environment in terms of being able to kind of, you know, identify from a particular location, whether that's yourself as a designer, or the community or a client that you represent, and the context in which you're operating? How important is that in you know, coming up with, you know, some sort of a resolution to a particular design challenge? Would somebody like to talk about that?
It should be. I think it should be essential. It's maybe the most important thing then. And that is, I think, if I understand your question correctly, that we always try to do to sort of bring in the new perspective in the context, and try to also, as again Bateson says, that the context of the context is also extremely important. And I think Hannes also mentioned that there's nothing except the context. You can't. You always need the environment and the context and the awareness of that. So for us, I think it's extremely essential, and something that we have to sort of rediscover all the time. It's nothing, and I think that is a lack in architecture history, that many architects has been too ignorant to that.
Mm-hmm. Hannes?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I have to get already the feeling that we will agree on many things, Magdalena, Gisle, and I. Today, I agree totally, and this context of the context is a very good description. The thing which I think is just like that, often when one looks or thinks, one works with those contextual phenomenon. The deeper one gets in, one realizes that there are so many, and one cannot work with all of them, or one cannot handle the complexity of it. And thank you for this notion, Magdalena, with the complexity. I think a complex system is, we intervene always in complex systems. And to make a short excursus, maybe a complex system is a system which is defined by at least 3 actors which act independently, and A, independently, and B, in interaction with each other. And so everything is a complex system where we intervene. And the problematics of that is, in a way, that a complex system cannot be kind of foreseen how it will develop or how it will behave or perform. So we can orient them. And this is, I use now words from my friend, Sepp Fröhlich, who is a complexity researcher who I invited to teach in our platform. And he was here for quite a few years. And that he says that we can only orient these systems. We cannot foresee how they develop. So here it comes into the game that we, at the one hand, can try and I think have to closely look how these systems are at work and what kind of forces are at work and what kind of organisms are there, but then also to kind of anticipate, and one can be wrong with that, anticipate the potential future or how this works, and to orient that in a way that it can always be shifted according to the diverse needs is probably the task of our not of our time, it always would have been, but it is the big task for us as people who do, if it comes to buildings, such a transforming work.
Yeah. Magdalena or Gisle, did you have any response or continue on the discussion?
Of the context, no, yeah, of course. I mean, and that is what, when we are working with ourselves and with the students, like this both curiosity and humbleness towards the context, that it's not a tabula rasa, and we are so eager, and you see in students, they are so eager to design and to come with solutions, and they start with a white sheet, but they are often a bit frustrated with the mapping. They want to design things, but most of them, when doing this work, are seeing that the world is kind of opening up and that the solution might not be what you thought it would be, or what you wanted to propose wasn't even a solution. It might have been destructive for the situation or for organisms or processes, and it's also, of course, in our times where we are so aware that, I mean, a context is also, it's a lot of things like processes and relations, but just the material today of an existing situation is a kind of a resource that we realize is how to say it, we don't have endless of resources. We really must work with what is there, both in order to preserve important things, but also to rework existing situations and materials, and yeah, and it's also, of course, this, yeah. Sorry.
No, sorry. When you talked about the white paper of the students, it came to my mind Giovanni Michelucci. I think he was already 86 years old when he was asked what he would suggest to young students today when he would still teach. And his answer was, well, the most important thing is to know nothing. And I think that describes it a little bit, this approach. And I am maybe from a generation which still has in mind, and often from the beginning, quite an idea. But it's the most interesting thing to see how these ideas are going somewhere totally else along the way when one starts to look what exists already on the site or contextually.
I think this is interesting also in terms of what do we sort of expect for the architect in the future to be. I mean, if you look upon it in a historical perspective, often the architect has been playing an imposing role, or maybe even a distracting role, because and on behalf of powers that you, or political powers or economic forces that you don't really take into consideration the context, neither the social context or the societal context or the natural context. So and you can imagine, especially maybe in the north or a more exotic part of the world, this colonial aspect is quite strong, and it still is. So I think there's much to gain for the future of the architectural role to sort of be exercising on this more humble approach. There are always something there, and of course that I think that has been sometimes a little bit disturbing about the architect's position in history. So I think we have a lot to sort of gain out of being more observative or more analytic and more humble in the approach.
May I just add something to your question, Kurt? Where does a site or start and where does it end? I think one context is also we as teams, as planning or designer teams, or research teams, or even larger, all these people who are involved in such a project, and how we integrate the ideas of others and how we work together. I mean, this is really also part of the site. The site is not a place where one builds something, but also from where the people come who work on it. I think this is really an interesting time to realize that we have to calculate a site deep into the ground and high up into the sky, because all is of influence, but also on a social level. And I think I could not say anymore what's the size of a site, or the scale, or the even the components.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and really good responses. Pallavi, you have your hand up. Did you have a question or interjection you'd like to add?
Yes, please. I have been listening to both, and fantastic. Thank you for the great presentations. When we started, we were thinking of the vocabulary that comes out of this conjunction between the mindful and the modern or modernism. And both your presentations really gave so much food for thought on the vocabulary that, but for example, when Hannes was talking about the endless house, but also you talking about the unending or the ongoing as, fragments that we work with in space and time, to use your words, Magdalena. Then you also talked about, I'm not sure if this, I'm probably rambling here, but the other things that I found is you talked about, Hannes, you talked about how a phenomena is changed by observation. The idea of looking at a phenomena versus the idea of mapping and tracing that Gisle and Magdalena, you are talking about. And I found myself thinking about these kind of juxtapositions that are probably talking about some similar things, but there is a slight difference between looking and mapping and observing and mapping. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that? Also the idea that, the tacit and being aware of tacit knowledge that Magdalena brought up. Again, I find a little bit of a switch when I think of tacit knowledge as something you cannot know about or you cannot describe. That's why it's called tacit. These are probably will really, if you want to expand a little bit on this juxtaposition that, if I'm even right in observing it as a juxtaposition, it will be great to help us build on the vocabulary that we intend to build.
Yeah. No, I was just thinking about, because I agree, Hannes, that I think we will probably agree on a lot of things, but I think for us it has been quite important to find ways of keeping the complexity in the process and not sort of trying to reduce, because if you all of these building processes and planning processes, they are so much directed towards some kind of reduction. We are to make decisions and so on. You need to make a sort of more reduced essence of it. And I'm not saying that for taking decisions, sometimes you need to make decisions what you are going to sort of study further or take decisions about. But this idea of keeping the complexity still if you have to find ways through that complexity in a spatial way, then I think that is quite important. And it's not easy, and it's not easy to say how to do it. But when you're talking about juxtaposition and sort of, I think that it's a little bit what we try to do then, to sort of study things through concepts, define concepts, and say that this is adding to the complexity or the complex understanding of a situation. Then, so not with the intention of finding solutions necessarily, but broadening the mind of the architect in the process. And I think that we have tried to do this sometimes also with, especially with students. It's much easier to work with students because then you are more free to sort of to work on deeply on it. And I think sometimes it's really mind-blowing what's coming out of that, and also on a personal level. And it also goes back to this role of the architect as not an observer and not as an outsider in it, but when you're entering into the process, it's also a process on yourself in the context. So, and you can never leave that out. And it's so I'm not sure if it's kind of answering to your question, but I think it's a part of it.
And I like what your quote, Hannes, on the most important is to know nothing, because it's kind of, in other words, what we often talk with the students about, that like if you come to a point where you think you know everything, then you should be worried. When they are a bit worried that everything is so complex, like how can we navigate? Like you should be more worried if you come out with the idea that now I know everything I need to know, in a way. So
Hannes,
maybe I try to go back also a little bit to what you have asked, Kurt, directly to that. You know, when I say a lot of things we do is observing and describing also. But description means, or what I have tried with the text on Fort Terrain, which this what I have read about Fort Terrain. I forgot to say it was a text I have written together with Brian Tabolt, an architect, a US architect. I should mention that, a friend and a person I work together also on other projects in Houston at the moment. And description or observation and description, I tried to formulate that a little bit in the Fort Terrain text and around it. But description means for us always production, and means always like, I mean, as architects, when I thinking, I say always to the students, thinking, or this is a quote by Enrique Miralles, drawing is thinking, or otherwise, when we as architects think, I always think I need to produce also something. So if I call this mapping or sketching, or however I call that, maybe my approach is a little bit more, there is a difference probably. I'm not that, let's say, not interested, but in calculable systems and in measurable systems. I try to observe and immediately kind of bring in also my position or the position of other people or into a transformation. So everything what we do is immediately also already a transformation. And when we do this in series, we can put together different like filters and look at the situation through these different filters. And I have developed a system or a method of description, which I try to always work with the students like that, which is very simple, which is always 4 questions. The first question is, what is it, what we look at when we observe? Or what is it? The second question is, what might it be? So a close reading, what is behind that? Colin Rowe would say, he distincts the visual and or seeing with the eyes is the optical, and seeing with the mind is the visual. So what is that? What we can visually read behind that question what it is. Then the third question would be, what might it become? So what is the potentiality of it, or what is artistically or architecturally, where could it go to? And then, and this is maybe something, and I like very much how Roger Corner was putting these two adverbs in when he talked about in one of the previous webinars about mindfulness, or the mindful, and he said then aware, he translated it with aware, and then put these two adverbs, first critical awareness in front, and then self-critical awareness. And I think this is something which is really becoming more and more aware for us. So the fourth question is always, what for? You know, why do I do that all? And also to bring in the own position. And in a way, unconsciously, I try to do that with every step. When I look at something which I found, or when I look at something I have produced, always go through these steps. And thus it's always, I mean, I think I hardly do an analysis in a kind of a way to that, you know, we take we count the numbers and look at that, but it's always I just believe that, and for what I said about the modern physics, that we look at it and it's translated. When you look at Claude Lévi-Strauss, and you know, when I don't know if he has written it or somebody else, when you go and look at the tribe, an unknown tribe somewhere, and you start to analyze it, it does not exist anymore. It's kind of an analysis, in my opinion, can also destroy something, because it is not anymore what it was before. So when you go into this tribe, which nobody met yet, and start to analyze, it is not what it was before anymore. And I think this happens with everything we look at. And maybe that's also an idea of, you know, of the what I try to say with the liminal, that I think our work is always a transitional work. It's never like statical on the facts, and then there is something else, a myth or something, and then we have a building in the end. It's all flux. Is this an answer? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that those are beautiful answers, and you know, makes me think of so many other things. Kurt, if I may add a few more thoughts that I'm getting, and this whole idea between the demarcation between nature and the sociocultural that you're bringing in some ways is very interesting. And it starts to make us think, and we've been talking about this, the curators in ourselves, we are talking about, yes, we have projected the mindful modernism as the theme, but is there a modern mindful that probably we are also thinking of here, which is, there are a few, John has a beautiful comment in, probably Kurt will take that up later, and David too. But from our side, we've been thinking in both ways, and if you could add your thoughts to the idea. And I know, Magdalena, you do engage in mindfulness in terms of, you know, the typical ways in which mindfulness is defined, and how we are trying to expand that beyond the regular conception of mindfulness as yoga practices or meditation practices. But you've worked with children and done, you know, probably you engage with yoga and other mindful activities like that. What do you think? And it's, of course, for all the speakers, what do you think is a modern mindful?
I don't, yeah, I just start, but I think, first of all, I think there, and again, thank you for inviting us. It has been so interesting to go into the themes that you have proposed since your first invitation and the first discussions we had, and as you express now while we are talking, that you can see juxtapositions, and you can see parts of the professional life and thinking overlap with the mindful thinking, and just modern mindful. I think it's in a way obvious that there is a need or a use for that thinking in the situation we are in, if it's modernity or, I mean, but yeah, in the global situation that we are in, to start there.
I think so. Sometimes it's interesting to try to reflect on what is the opposite of being mindful, to try to understand what mindful is, maybe. And again, I'm maybe a little bit obsessed about Bateson, but I think he reflects on a lot of issues. So he's talking about the mindless as a sort of maybe the opposite of mindful, and he talks a lot about the consequences of being mindless, and that is quite devastating in his terms. Then that it's the total lack of awareness and a total lack of morality and ethics, and so I think by sort of try to define the opposite of mindful, it is maybe easier to sort of come closer to what mindful could be than in a modernist way, because so I'm not sure, but for us I think it's a lot about awareness, and this Latour shift is of course very known, this from matters of fact to matters of concern, and he tries to define what concern is about then, and it's sort of this leading up to all these things that we have not been able to define but has a consequence, and also is about taking the consequence into our practice. So I think it's about these things, and to be aware about what we are doing as architects, because we are agents of change in all ways. So yeah, as a start again.
Yeah, and also reflecting back on what Hannes said just recently, like the awareness of your own role in the relation to the environment, but to the work you do, the proposals, like that there is a deep connection, and that you as yourself, not only as a person, or even a soul, or not only as a kind of expert or solver of problems, presence in and connection.
Very nice. Hannes, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, maybe. I think what we as humans are capable to be aware of, for sure, is different in every era, or in every time we live in, or in every environment we are. And I mean, I think what we face now with the pandemics is that we get aware of so many different things, and so many different, like, inner moves of people become legible to us, or it comes out. So we start to be aware of other things which we could probably not see before. So when one says like would use the term contemporary for modern, then I think there is absolutely a modern mindfulness, and that's why probably also we all the three, Magdalena, Gisle, and I, were so much talking about ecology today. I mean, I try to show that these topics were also kind of mindfully treated from some people in classical modernism, but it was a kind of not the major topic. And now it's really like on the forefront, and I think we cannot not talk about, as architects, when we talk about at least about our work, we cannot talk about mindfulness without respecting the fact that the ecological systems are totally out of balance, and that we have to, that we rather deal with it and respectfully deal with it. I think that's something which is really, if you want so, a contemporary issue. I do not know if this is really like then what you mean with modern, or what the question means with modern.
It's definitely a question without a definitive answer, but it's, you know, posed to generate more of kind of a discussion or an investigation. And in many ways, you know, some of the things that we're, you know, looking at when we talk about, you know, a mindful modernism or modern mindfulness is to, first of all, you know, understand the basic sort of, you know, traditional definitions, but then also what are the potentialities, right, about how far this could be taken. And I think, Gizly, you know, your approach of saying, you know, how do you define what mindfulness is in design? Well, maybe it's about how do we respond to the mindlessness that we see, right, from a moral and sort of ethical position about, you know, the things that are being done in the world, and saying there's something wrong here, and that you're aware, you know, of what is going wrong, and then, you know, developing the fortitude and the sort of agenda to actually make that change, to be mindful, is that sort of meta awareness of kind of saying, I am aware of a particular situation, I'm understanding my role in this, this is how I could, you know, see myself kind of evolving and participating. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, some of these ideas of mindfulness, these are some of the explorations, you know, that we're thinking about. And when we were discussing, you know, this idea of the liminal space, one of the things that came up in your discussions, which, you know, I thought was, you know, as an interesting prompt to kind of get, you know, both of you together and over a shared topic, there was also a different approach to maybe thinking and talking about liminality. There are some commonalities, but there's also some differences. So I just wanted to maybe ask you a little bit about the liminal space in juxtaposition to the liminal process. So we understand liminal as kind of this sort of transition zone, you know, between one state of affairs to another, that maybe it's somehow a bridge, a connector, that we occupy the sort of middle space between two defined areas or so forth. I mean, there's a lot of fecundity in that term. We could really kind of, you know, define it in separate ways. But could the liminal be made manifest? Could it be made concrete in, you know, architectural expression? And where would you kind of see the liminal existing in the design process, about thinking, about making, you know, the whole sort of, you know, evolution towards, you know, the final product? So, you know, liminal as a product, you know, the actual entity, the thing that is constructed, versus liminal in the process. And I think both of your collective works touch on both. I wondered maybe you could talk a little bit about how you see the liminal maybe in the built and then also in the process.
Yeah, first, if I can just start, is again what you say makes me think of many things, but in many work, I mean, in planning, a lot of time, I mean, in every project, but in planning, a lot of time is involved, is part of the process, but is often kind of not discussed, maybe more than a timeline or a schedule or maybe a problem. But so liminality is kind of ever present, and we have tried to work in planning projects or competitions with that transition as both an experience and physical matter in a way, and then most of all something, again, in the mindfulness, or kind of something to be aware of, and that we cannot only have this before and after pictures. There is something happening, and people are living in that space under development, or also with plans that might not turn out as planned, or changes constantly. I mean, the only thing we know is that it will not be as it was planned. So then this, how to say, yeah, it's not an answer to your question, it's just my thoughts when listening to.
We tried, there's a quite interesting example of a process that we did not show now, but Maybe some of you know, in northern Sweden, there is a mining town called Kiruna. It's one of the most productive places of iron ore in the world. And they are expanding the mine, so the city has to move. So some years ago, they had this international competition about how to move the city because of the mine. And we took part in that process, and we used this transition situation and this sort of continuous process of change for a long time as a design process. And we sort of used the temporality or the changing situation as a design tool. And of course, we didn't win that because it became too complex for them, I think, to grasp the concept. And the one that won, the project proposal that won, was showing a defined final city, taken from one place, placed to another place, because that is a sort of a, and of course with a lot of fancy pictures showing how nice it should be. So I think for us it's a little bit abstract to talk about it, but for us it became a really interesting process of see what is there, what is going to happen in this long transition period, and how can we sort of work with that as a architectural and artistic material. And I think it became a quite interesting project out of it, but it's extremely difficult to communicate, and it's extremely difficult to sort of sell it on this market of imagining what it could be done. But I think it's we should focus more on the process, I think, and be more conscious about this continuous transition. And also Hannes has been talking about several times is this what we are doing is more or less a continuous change. And again, what Bateson talks about is you will never pick up the same thing. You will never pick up the same children or child, because the next time you pick it up, it's changed. Even though it's not visible, it has changed. So, and that is a fact that we sort of have to learn to live with and use, I think.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
That you come back always to Bateson again, and when one thinks about the metalogs, you know, where he talks with his daughter, I think that shows exactly that in a way the liminal or this transitional phase is constant. So somehow, I mean, I did once a project still back in school, which I called Fortlaufendes Haus, ongoing house, when I would translate it. And I realized that I'm doing always the same project. It just shows up at different places in different times and with different tasks. And so we have this expression, anhaltend means going on, and it's anhaltend means also stopping at the same time. So it's anhaltend fortlaufend means as well continuously, but also again and again stopping continuous, you know. And there is already this strange thing in this word that it means in a way opposite has opposite meanings. And I just was thinking now how I could answer this question in terms of I think it depends on the scale also in the scale you're working in, but also where you put yourself, position yourself, or see yourself in space and time, how you would answer this question, or with in what kind of time frame, or you know, when I was then thinking planning or designing is probably a liminal process because it is a transitional phase until when one is aiming for building. As architects, it's until it's built. But as soon as a drawing becomes a model, an artifact, something put in a museum, it's not liminal anymore. Then it's beyond that. While the process of building, I would say, is at the one hand liminal because, or not liminal because you start, or the objects become statical, not because there is no statics, but kind of come in an equilibrium state. But at the same time, one could say, you know, in order to do that, you have to stop everything around you, and more or less you have to kind of hold on time so that you can build something. Because if time would run and all the processes would run, you could not pour concrete, you could not like keep the plan as the plan how it is, you know. So I think this is probably always also like everything in what we face, cyclical. I think more and more that there is nothing which is not cyclical and thus in motion, and thus when you're aware of what moment you are in, you realize that you are always, you know, when we one thought more. I always, when I finish a project, or when we have finished a project and I hand it in, let's say a competition, and I ask myself, why am I so disappointed? I could be happy. We have done long work and great, but the thing is that in mind, the project is so much further already. I hand in an old project, you know? Mm-hmm. So this is all that I think is interesting, or would be interesting, I think now on without, to look at through this particular word.
I really know that feeling, so I can. But I was thinking about this circularity versus the linearity of thinking. That we're talking about liminality as something that continuously changing, but we are also working quite a lot in the Sami, the indigenous landscapes of northern Scandinavia, and that is quite an interesting learning process, because there everything is circular. It's sort of always coming back, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't change or that it is not different. Of course it is, but still it's not a linear thought, it's a circular thought. And because it's connected to the movement or the shifts in the landscape during the seasons. And that's everything. Everything is connected to the seasons. Seasonal shifts. So it's not important what sort of goes beyond and this is not like it's almost like a life circle going on and going on. You're not jumping out of that. You are continuously in the same circular process. And I think that is also a quite interesting set of mind to sort of enter into as an architect. Or as a modernist thinking person, that we are maybe should, if we connect more to the circular processes in nature, then I think that will also impact our way of thinking as modernists, architects, or whatever, because it's different. Everything is coming back, sort of. But change this combination is, it's interesting to try to see how other cultures also act in the landscape, because it can with an open mind it is also a new way of seeing. It's also a new way of adding perspectives to our own way of thinking. So yeah, at least for us, it has become quite important.
Mm-hmm. I think those are great points. I want to be mindful of the time because I know we're reaching about 2 hours now. So what I'd like to do is just wrap up today's discussion. I think it's been just fascinating, and I think I could sit here, all day listening to all of you talk, because the insights and ideas that you're all generating are very interesting and very fascinating. But I also do want to be mindful of everyone's time. So maybe what we can do is we can end the session. I want to read one question and one comment from the audience. I know that the panelists have already read it, but just for the benefit of everybody who's here, I think we want to respect everybody's participation here. So this question is from John Rossini. Thank you, John, for your question. He's curious about corralling the meaning of mindfulness in architecture. And he says, in contemplative studies, mindfulness is broadly understood as awareness in the present moment. Is mindfulness in architecture about a new and expansive discourse of architecture as environment rather than space, as Hannes has explored? Or can it also be about a different process for architectural inquiry, and one which draws upon understandings from contemplative studies such as those by Komiyathi and Kabat-Zinn? And he is curious to know the panel's view about the latter possibility, which is its definition for mindful architecture, or the character of the mindful architect. So here's the question. Is the goal of mindful architecture not just a reimagining of, say, modernism, but in addition about, say, the existential transformation of the architect? And I think, we've touched upon this a lot already, but I would just ask the panel to maybe, think about the application of mindfulness in architecture. Is it about the profession, about, the practice process, or is it about the individual, the being about, becoming a more mindful person, or a combination of both? I would throw this out to the panelists to discuss. Anybody have any thoughts on where mindfulness in architecture should lie? Where it does lie, maybe?
Sure. Hannes?
I mean, may I answer with Bateson? He, as far as I remember, he asks really for a transformation of everything, and also that we have to strengthen us as individuals and as communities. I don't can refer in the particular vocabulary, but he stresses it quite particularly how much we have to reinvent ourselves, and we have to build up new communities with different kind of rules or let's say behaviors. And I think, yes, for sure, as much as we have to change all our lifestyle, we have to invent us as architects anew. Some things are anyway done by others, which we cannot influence. Our profession has changed so much since I'm involved in this field, but I think, yes, and maybe I come back to these two terms Roger put in front of the alertness or awareness, which first was criticality or critical awareness, critical alertness, and then self-critical alertness. And I think when we put that there, and I'm really thankful for these two terms, then we know that both aspects, which John, I think his name was asking, are totally crucial, and one can almost not like separate both from each other.
Yeah, I think,
I think so many moments here where you all put things into words that makes me rethink, but the beautiful like existential transformation of the architect. I mean, I think I don't know if you agree, but when we do projects, maybe that is really what we are aiming for. And with the students, how to say, we are not really kind of I don't know if you agree. We are not really teaching them anything, but that might be just what should come out of a studio like the one we showed you as an example. It might, and sometimes we discuss it with them, like when they are a bit scared, like, does it mean, I mean, will it inform me as an architect studying the birds and that might be the answer. Yeah, it's an existential transformation of you as an architect if you do it. So that is, and also like whatever theme or interest you have into the context or the situation. When you go into it deep enough, you will be transformed, or your position and your awareness and yeah.
It's like it's the saying of you should never let a crisis pass away, not using it for something, or it's a possibility. Also, if of course that's easy to say when you are safe and at home, but I think this what you said, Hannes, that architecture as a profession is really under pressure, or the architect, it is a role that is in transformation, and I really think this is a possibility to be more conscious about what does that mean for the role of an architect. What possibilities does it bring up for us to sort of reconfigure or rethink what we are in fact doing? So I'm not repeating what you both said, but I think that is also something to point at, that I think this is also a question of using this possibility of transition to something else, because either we do it consciously or we are pushed in some direction from the larger society then. So, but I agree on both analysis.
Very thoughtful answers. And I think we could kind of guess that from your discussion all the way through about how you feel about, the awareness and, the presence of the architect and the designer and their place, in the entire process. And I think, both of you may not, practice mindfulness in its traditional sense, yet it's somehow imbued in everything that you do, in the way you think about the projects and the way you proceed through the design and execution. And I think it's very evident in the work and the way you talk about it that you are practicing a brand of mindfulness that maybe not in name only, but definitely in approach and concept, which is very strongly evident. Thank you for those comments. The last comment I want to read is more of a comment rather than a question, but I would like to read it anyways. It has to do with liminal space. It's from David Lieberman. David says, liminal space or liminality is formally defined as a space of transition, and too often refers to the sort of occupation of descriptors such as corridors and such. Magdalena and Gizly speak of imbrication, layering, and vulnerability, and the evolving natural landscape. Hannes, in referencing endlessness in Keisler, aspires to a fluid territory of exchange and interpretation in the constructed landscape. Is the liminality in contemporary practice not momentary occupation of passage, but rather transformative moments of pause and reflection, prioritizing experience as the change where the architecture becomes the set of alchemical instruments of opportunity? It is as dancers, choreographed and improvised, that we engage and apprehend space. And he just says, thank you for the provocation to creative thought, pushing the limits or boundaries of consideration. Thank you, David. Didn't either any of you want to respond to David's definition of liminality? And is there any sort of resonance with what we've been talking about today you'd like to comment on?
Yeah. I totally agree. Since when we said whenever we intervene in an ecosystem or in whatever system, we change it, and it also changes us back, since it's reciprocal. So when a transitional space is therefore by definition a transformative space, I guess, and the question is maybe always on which level this transformation takes place. And this is, for us human beings, a mental or a transformation, or is it a physical tool? And also there, I think this is all, the older one gets, the more one realizes how much everything is connected also in the body, not only we with our environments, but also the environments within us. And so, yeah, I tried with my diploma back in the days with this short, I showed only one section with the Goya paintings to prove that there is no statics. And if there is no statics, it's always flux. And if there is always flux, it's all transformation. So yeah, thank you, David, for this view.
It's a beautiful comment. So I also like to read it. And but I was just briefly reflecting on. We have seen recently colleagues, architects that are now working on restoring of destroyed natural landscapes as also an architectural work, and where you need the architect as a transforming agent, but then with a totally different perspective of what the architect is doing. So I was just reading it, or this kind of aspect also into the comment that I really like. So it's really beautiful.
Yeah, and I also reading it or listening to it, I was thinking about, yeah, what I wouldn't say if it's unique to our profession, but we are very much connecting, or more than some other professions, connecting the material and the physical to the mental and the lived and the experienced. And I think this liminal space or liminality is a very strong tool when working with the people concerned or involved in the space we are working with. It's really about connecting and presenting and discussing the transition as both a process of mind and materiality, where I think maybe the architect has a unique position and knowledge to enter in those processes, or to be to play an important role in those processes.
Yeah, beautifully put. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the comments and the questions from the audience. That was very much appreciated. And I would like to wrap up today's session by thanking Magdalena, Gisle, and Hannes for taking their time and participating in this discussion and this session. It's been a complete joy for me to moderate and to be involved and listen to you talk about your practice, your work, and your thought. And I'd just like to invite everybody who's participating today for a virtual hand clap and say thank you very much for the wonderful session today. It's been really wonderful. And I'll just hand it back over to the panelists just to say a few closing comments or words, and then I'll hand it over for Pallavi for wrap up. Gisle and Magdalena, do you have any last comments or just thanks?
Oh, not except we want also to thank Roger, and he is not with us, but right. He was also our introduction to this session in the beginning. So, but I would really say that we appreciate to be invited, and it's always interesting to put the work into so specific sort of conceptual thoughts. So you have to reflect on what you're doing in a different perspectives also. So, but I think that has been a really nice experience for us. And
that will for sure continue. I feel that there is, I mean, we're going to end this now, but it will continue. And thank you so much for kind of organizing. And in that sense, I mean, also the intellectual framework and the discussions that we have had. It has been so more than interesting, very kind of building new worlds in our minds and reflections. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you. Hannes, any closing comments?
I also would like to thank you all, and yeah, Roger too. And I think it's really interesting to bring in this term mindfulness into this discussion in our field. And I congratulate you to have set up this institute, or however it is called. It's, but I think it's an important it's an important work, and I have to further think also what it means to me. And it was interesting to think a little bit about these topics you have brought up, and thank you so much for that. And yeah, congrats. Thanks.
Thank you. And just as a reminder to everybody in the audience, we will be putting together documents either in the form of papers, transcriptions, or essays or commentaries based upon these sessions. So we're asking each of the participants to contribute in a way, and we're hoping to put together a collective publication for this webinar series once it's completed and that we've been able to gather everybody's work. So look for that probably sometime later next year. So I'd just like to thank everybody and again, pass it over to Pallavi for the closing remarks. Pallavi?
Thank you, Kurt. That was a great session, everybody. And I personally want to thank our three speakers, and also on behalf of Roger, who's probably on a plane right now on the top of the Atlantic somewhere. But he definitely asked me to pass his regards and thank you for making this session so memorable. I think the ideas that came through are really unique. And as Kurt said, we will be following it up with a scholarly publication, and we'll get in touch with you at a later date. I also wanted to thank John Rossini and David Lieberman for their comments and questions. And John, you will be happy to hear that our next session, which is happening next week, features Louis Comiati, who is also with us today in the audience, and some of his ideas about contemplative thinking brought into architecture will be our next session on November 27th. He will be in conversation with Andrew King from Montreal, and we will talk about contemplative studies and the built space, a new modern. That's the heading or the title for next week's webinar, which we are very excited about. So please join us then. It'll be Saturday, November 27th at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you again, Hannes and Gisle. I hope you have a good evening, and we'll be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.